Good evening. I hope you had a pleasant and mindful day. And I hope that those whom you love and you care about, and all the different virtuous pursuits that you're reaching out for, have been fruitful. I have been thinking about Nietzsche, um, in particular his critiques of Christianity. And this is coming from a place of just reading various pagans, right? Neo-pagans, and their arguments and justifications for their frame of reference and how they make sense of the world. And quite a few of them would appeal to Nietzsche's critique. And I found it odd that many people, or like there's a portion in a movement that found his arguments to be compelling, right? And so it started bothering me in that I was wondering, what is it that I'm failing to see? What is it am I failing to comprehend, right? Why do some people see him as such? Why do some people find his critique to be so persuasive? And yet for me, I felt that it didn't meet a criterion that would push me to think that it's actually quite a strong critique of it, right? And the first thing that struck me was that it seems to me that in the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche did not reflect far back enough in history. And it's true, the resources he had were limited, and the capacity of, or rather, the technology by which they would be able to preserve and pass information was severely limited compared to that which I have currently, right? And I think he's failing to consider what I would describe as physical superiority contrasted against spiritual superiority. Now, physical superiority in the sense of just that pertaining to the material world, right? The object of physics, matter, energy, right? The subject matter of natural science. And spiritual superiority becoming now relating to that which transcends the purely natural world or the physical world. And I think he's failing to appreciate the distinction of the conqueror as right against the overseer, one that is able to impose his will upon others against one that commands the respect of others, right? And I think it's because in his ethical view, he's failing to appreciate the distinction between perfection and power, right? The one way of seeing a perfection or conceptualizing of a perfection is the logical maximum of a thing. And therefore would be let's say for instance, the logical maximum of power is omnipotence, right? The logical maximum of knowledge is omniscience, right? And a hero, one way of seeing a hero is as an exemplar, right? So the exemplar is one that attains a perfection or comes closest to a particular perfection. And that in contrasted to a conqueror, right? Who is one that is able to conquer, right? Basically impose his will, use force or ingenuity or something of, use something that allows you to compel another, right? And I think there's an interesting parallel to draw between Nietzsche's hero and as a part of the lineage by which the modern progressive hero is formed, and contrasting him to the traditional hero, right? And that particular, if I think, can be seen in the stories that describe the DC comic character Superman, right? So old school Superman, you'd say, is a hero that was looking to be an exemplar. So he's one that is hiding his identity. He sees himself as an institutional man, right? As one belonging to this society in a metropolis. And there are certain obligations and duties that he has to participate in. And that allows him to use his gifts, right? And this is now why he's a hero, as a moral exemplar, right? And therefore he had the power to bend the world to his will and subject the people to do that which he desired, right? but then he chooses not to. So we can say classic Clark Kent, the Boy Scout, right? Captain America, right? Prior to Ta-Nehisi Coates' run, actually even earlier, right? When you have him as the right, like even the like old Cyclops would be another moral exemplar, right? And they're not necessarily the best in terms of, they're not the strongest necessarily in terms of power, but they are leaders in terms of virtue, right? Or by embodying and exemplifying a virtue, they're able to lead men, and they're able to become overseers of men, leaders, bishops of men, and direct them in a particular path. That's a bit different from, let's say, Conan the Barbarian story, right? Or Superman in Injustice, right? Who has been so broken in his sorrow, right? So lacking in fortitude, right? And sense of justice, that he goes on to impose, to use his power to bend other people to his will. Not saying that there isn't a time where a moral exemplar might be forced to act in that manner, right? Because one of the virtues you'd say is that sense of justice. But then another way I would say is the distinction between acknowledging the logos, right, and directing desire to operate in concert or in harmony with logos, against seeing desire itself as the end and pushing it. And I think that's why in reflecting, in examining the issue, right, or in examining Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, why it would have been nice to have been able to engage with Kierkegaard and with Dostoevsky, where there are three men who we could say they are starting in a similar plane, and they are tackling a similar type of problem in a similar type of social milieu. And on one end, they are noticing certain deficiencies in the cultural consensus that they're living in, right? And they are seeking to address it. And I think you can pit the will to power, right, against Kierkegaard's leap of faith. And I think you can also compare them with Dostoevsky examining the elimination of doubt, right? So in Dostoevsky, you get this idea that it is one thing to recognize the truth, but it's another thing to eliminate the doubt, right? Dostoevsky points out that if God does not exist, everything is permitted, right? But then, since everything is not permitted, since there is an ought, right? Since we have consciousness, a conscience, and that conscience is free, it's now down to a question of accepting God's world or rejecting God's world. And so I think that idea in Dostoevsky of accepting or rejecting God's word can be another way of saying that an individual is conforming himself to logos or trying to work against the logos, right? And therefore, Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, his distinction between master morality and slave morality, is, to my understanding currently, nothing more than a rhetorical device, right? So in that, while Christianity is pushing people and calling people towards perfection, him is calling them towards desire. And since both him and Kierkegaard are starting from the place of self, and even to some extent Dostoevsky, they're starting from the place of self, right? And knowing, they're identifying that the individual, right, the man, the hero, even though he's part of this institution, because I think man is an institutional animal, right? And those existential needs allows him to uniquely contribute to the institution, right? And that's now the whole idea of division of labor can stem from that, and the desire to be wanted, to be needed, right? To contribute something. I think it's tied up to man being an institutional animal, right? And I think Kierkegaard is able to identify that logical reasoning alone, right? Or perhaps I should describe it as quantitative reasoning alone, is inadequate or insufficient for the human being to operate in the institutions and participate in the institutions that they're creating. Because the human being is operating, let's say, like if you look at the relationship between a parent and a child, as the parent is having an influence on the child is also having an influence on the parent. And as the child is adjusting and changing due to the interaction with the parent is also adjusting and changing due to the interaction with the child. And therefore the human being adds or affects the institution as the institution affects and changes him to some degree, right? And will to power is rejecting the institutional nature of man, right? And it would fall to that trap of seeing man as purely as an individual. It would be akin to a man trying to understand the life of a bee without considering its place in the hive, or the life of a wolf without considering its place and the impact on the pack, on the wolf. To quote Dave the Distributist, the strength of the wolf is the pack, and the strength of the pack is the wolf, right? And that's why I think it's one of the reasons when you just try to think about human beings and the activity, the human activity in general, for it to be successful and for it to have impact, institutionalizing things does help a lot, right? And thereby, I think Nietzsche is wrong about Christianity because he fails to appreciate that man is an institutional animal, that there is the self, but then the self is connected to the other. So man is an I, and man is also a we, right? And so why the leap of faith, why you should have considered the leap of faith is that, in the point of quantitative versus qualitative reasoning. So, okay, to draw a distinction between those two, or what I mean by making that distinction. For example, when you're thinking about ethics, I would argue that there you're thinking qualitatively, right? In contrast to when you're following, deductive argument, right? No, actually that doesn't make it clear. Okay, there's a way of reasoning by which you can guarantee, right? You can guarantee the truth of. So let's say something like 1 + 1 equals 2. So it's complete. All the axioms or the observations are pretty clear, and everybody accepts them, and it is true. And if you follow the argument all along, you come to an end. And so this type of thinking is that which we have built around our intellectual pursuits, right? And so that way we can say is logical reasoning. It is that which allows us to deal with the rational aspects of the world. But in the same vein, there's still some irrational aspects to reality, right? To give an example of, it's now, how do you pick between two exactly identical objects? So if they're two exactly identical cars and you have to pick one, how do you end up picking one over the other, right? If they're two, that which allows you to deal with absurdity, that which allows you to deal with ambiguity, right? And in Kierkegaard's leap of faith, I think Kierkegaard is pointing us to these two frames of thinking, these two lines of thinking. And so we can use both our qualitative and quantitative reasoning. And now, so faith in itself is not irrational and it's not unreasonable because you're still thinking through and you're still following certain axioms to their logical conclusion, right? But then some of them is beyond your capacity to guarantee. So for instance, I'm pretty certain the sun will rise tomorrow, but it's something beyond my capacity to guarantee, right? Because how can I guarantee that the probability of the sun rising up tomorrow is absolutely zero, right? And so that's what I think the leap of faith captures, that we have other rational faculties. We are actually combining all these things to make our rational or reasonable judgment, right? So we use our intuitions, right? We use our reasoning. We draw from our experiences, right? We draw from other sources. So we can look to authorities, right? We can look to tradition. We can look to revelation. So the leap of faith is that gamble that the individual has to make, right? And I think that gamble that the individual is forced to make, right, where he's supposed to choose to make his home, right, is now just describing the institutional solution to man's existential needs, right? And that can tie us now to Dostoevsky's elimination of doubt. Now let's say I see all the evidence that something is true. But we do have cases where the individual, that even though something is true, there's still that doubt. You put your key in the pocket, right? But then every 10, 20 minutes, you need to check to confirm that it's there. That side that puts us towards verification, right? because the truth value is always true, right? The truth value of a statement remains constant as long as the being of the thing does not change, right? But then, so when you are verifying or you are confirming and you are checking, right, that's the step of eliminating doubt, right? And so, yeah, and so because Nietzsche was not able to contend with elimination of doubt and was not able to contend with the leap of faith, he ended up being wrong about Christianity, right? And his moral system ends up being critiquing just a small aspect of Christian morality. So he did not see morality as being expressions of perfections, right? He did not see what as power as a substrate of this ethical framework that is really all encompassing, right? And it's trying to make sense of both theological and metaphysical and physical reality in this one unified text that cross-references each other. And so perhaps Nietzsche is a Christian or is a victim of a purely cultural Christianity. And because so many things were taken for granted, he was not able to contend with the meat of the subject matter. The aspects of Christian thought that would keep you reflecting for hours upon hours on end, because you realize that there's something running, there's a thread that seems to be running just beneath the surface of what you've read. So it's one thing to say Jesus guaranteeing that Lazarus is going to rise from the dead, but then when he comes to where Lazarus is, he weeps. So since he's expecting Lazarus to resurrect, why is he crying? What's causing the weeping? Is there something deeper being communicated? Or in the Old Testament, when you start encountering this character that is described by the term angel of the Lord, right? The being that appears to Manoah in the book of Judges, but then is the same one that wrestled with Jacob for the whole night and was somehow present during the Exodus as a cloud by day or a pillar of fire by night. So there seems to be this far deeper reality that the authors are describing. And it seems to mirror reality in a really funny way, whereby you can take a theological view of the world, but at the same time you can describe those things and phenomena in a metaphysical manner, but still you can give it a natural description. And so there's this layers of comprehension and layers of theorizing. So it's like you have your physics, but then now you have to contend with a metaphysics. You have your theology, but you have to contend also with your meta-theology. And that's why I think Nietzsche is wrong with Christianity. I mean, he's wrong about Christianity. He seems to be oblivious to this odd undercurrent that is flowing behind the obvious. There's something that's more fundamental than that is running through the idea: love your neighbor as you love yourself, or love your love your enemies, right? If somebody slaps you, turn the other cheek. Somebody forces you to go 1 mile, go with him too, right? That do not resist an evil man. Do not repay evil with evil. Repay evil with good. So that these threads of ideas that you can explain to a child and a child can follow, Jesus, Son of God. But there's this undercurrent of ideas that is more substantial, right? That requires much more intellectual rigor and use of much more sophisticated reasoning tools that would make the most intelligent and most educated of men pause and reflect for a period of time. And that's one of the odd things about Christian thinking, whereby there's a way you can explain it to a 5-year-old, and a 5-year-old can be a good, consistent Christian, right? The 50 IQ individual can be a good, consistent Christian. But then it has enough substance and meat for the 200 IQ Christian to contend with for the rest of his life. Yeah. And that's my 2 cents on the matter. Yeah, thank you.